and that's not a big deal. We can survive without grants or loans. Because I think in order to, we've got a fairly aggressive system. Many of you are residents in Rockland or know our system. We've been metered for a long time. We've got fairly aggressive rates. We've got pretty good conservation practices already, none of which counts. Because you have to, from wherever you are, you have to cut another 20%. That's the way they wrote the rules. And we think that in order to do that, we'd have to require most of our single-family residential customers to redo their landscaping and eliminate about half their lawn. The staff member that recommends that to a board member, and the board member that says that's a good idea and carries it out, the board member gets unelected, and the new board members fire the staff members, and this is not good. So the struggle for us becomes not how are we going to do 20% conservation, it's how we're going to defend our water rights if we don't do 20% conservation. And we've got a fairly aggressive effort that we're teeing up for that. But what annoys me about it is that the reason they want the 20% is they want us to leave more water in the river and use that water to push the salt water back to keep the delta fresh so that Southern California can take their water and not have a problem. And that's what we call a water war, and they won the last round, so we're gearing up for the next round. The other side of this coin is that there's an $11 billion bond measure on the ballot next November. It's a water bond. And they've sprinkled it with lots of ornaments because they'd like it to pass. But the essence, the heart of the bond measure is that if you build a peripheral canal, Southern California says, we'll pay for the cost of constructing the canal. But it's not that simple. If you build a canal, there's a ton of mitigation measures that have to be implemented, impacts that have to be mitigated for. And so the bulk of this bond measure is to pay for those mitigation measures. So if the bond passes, the mitigation measures will be paid for. Southern California will pay for the construction of the canal. They'll take their water off, and then if we all in Northern California don't implement our 20% conservation, there'll be a problem in the Delta, and they'll be coming after us strong. If the bond measure doesn't pass, then the funding of the canal becomes a much more problematic for Southern California, and they don't need our 20% conservation quite so bad because they're not taking their water out of the peripheral canal. So just my vote, don't hold it against any directors you happen to know for Placer County Water Agency, but I recommend voting against the bond measure. Plus the fact California can't afford it. I think it's like $600,000 or $600 million a year in debt service that we added to our little budget problem. So anyway, questions? Any questions on that? Yes.
What happens if all of this succeeds? What happens in Southern California? They don't get these ones.
Thank you. Good. Southern California's got a genuine water supply problem. Maybe you've all heard there have been 3 straight years of drought in California. No, there haven't been 3 straight years of drought. There have been 3 straight years in which the average for the state has been below average. It used to be early in my career, there was average, there was below average, there was dry, and there was critically dry. And you had to be down around 60% of average before you got to the point where you considered it to be dry. I mean, half the time it's below average, right? Sort of the definition of average. Anyway, it's gotten to the point where with the judge ordering restrictions on the pumps. Let me do this whole other Southern California water. Southern California went and developed the Owens Valley and started drying up Mono Lake. They were overusing the water supply, and the judge ordered them to stop and cut back their use of Owens Valley water. They had a contract to take water from the Colorado River. And they were allowed, California in whole had a contract for 4.4 million acre feet. They were overdrafting the contract from Colorado River water by 1 million acre feet. And the water that they were overdrafting belonged to Arizona. And Arizona went to court and said, we want our water, and California had to cut back. So the final external source they had was to come to the Delta. So they started overdrafting the Delta. And the overdraft of the Delta drove the ecology of the Delta into a tailspin. And the judge ordered them to cut back pumping from the Delta. During that entire period, which is a range of about 25 years, urban development, was completely unchecked anywhere in Southern California. I mean, you all know it, all the way out to Riverside. Practically at Palm Springs, is Los Angeles today. So now they've got themselves into a real big problem. They need the peripheral canal in the worst way. The solution is to unravel this myth that fresh water is good and salt water is bad, and let the salt water flex up farther into the Delta, closer to the city of Sacramento, so that we don't have to put extra water into the Delta to keep the Delta fresh. Because the pumps aren't there anymore. The diversion would be in Hood or Franklin, south of Sacramento. That would be a solution, but the environmentalists won't go for that. Plus, the environmentalists, I mean, remember, there was 4 organizations in the room to cut this deal. One of them was the Environmental Defense Fund. And their pound of flesh for this deal, the deal that got struck in Sacramento, was that Northern California had to do this 20% conservation and that the Delta had to be kept fresh. And so it's going to crash and burn, I think, because I don't think the bond measure is going to pass. Well, that's the prevailing Northern California perspective, but they've got to remember they got 25 million voters in Southern California, so it may pass yet.
It seems to me like we really don't have a water problem, we've got a storage problem. We receive a lot of rain and snowfall, and we realize it's up and down years, but why won't the politicians go for building more reservoirs? This escapes my mind when coming.
Well, there are two reasons for that. One is the economics of it, and two is the reality of environmental laws. Why don't they just keep pumping water out of the Delta like they did before? What is it with this little Delta smell? Who cares, right? Well, there's a law. It's called the Endangered Species Act, and it trumps almost everything. And there's nothing you can do about it except try to change the law. Richard Pombo was elected from over near Tracy. He went to Congress and tried real hard to get it overturned, the Endangered Species Act, and was unelected. There's nobody in Congress pushing to do this, and it's just not going to happen, so you got to deal with it. There's a popular myth with the Auburn Dam, which is the financial example, which was that it got stopped by the environmentalists. It didn't. There was a design, there was an earthquake in Oroville, the design was stopped, and the Bureau of Reclamation redid the design to be able to handle earthquakes. And when they redid it, Reagan was governor, and he changed the rules, and he said, in order for the federal share to be spent, the Bureau had to go find matching local funds. So somebody had to agree to buy the water for enough money to pay for like half the project. And at that time, it would have been $1,000 an acre foot. And nobody would sign up for that kind of money to pay for the water. And that was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Anyway, so Auburn Dam is often looked at as, it was a project that people thought was reasonable at one time, but it was so expensive. There are no good projects. The only thing that even comes close is to build a project on a side channel that isn't really on a river, and then when you have flood water, you pump water up into it, and then you let it back down. So one of the popular alternatives